why I'm sitting here today talking about redefining fashion. I became part of Fashion Revolution over a decade ago and was spearheading Fashion Revolution India's arm of the organization. And essentially, we founded as an organization in response to the Rana Plaza disaster, where the world saw one of the largest industrial disasters in its history. I think it was the fourth largest industrial disaster, where a factory collapsed in Dhaka in Bangladesh. And simply because safety measures weren't met and their voices weren't heard, well-versed consumer to make empowered decisions about fashion, and also to spotlight some of the major issues that are in the supply chain in the fashion and textiles industry. So 10 years on, I've actually stepped out of Fashion Revolution. I also do multiple other things. However, it's a cause that's dear to my heart. And in 10 years, I've seen lots of amazing organizations campaign for a fairer, safer, and more transparent fashion industry. And it's just brilliant to have at the click of a button so much information. It can be overwhelming, and this whole subject can be quite daunting at times. Fashion actually has one of the largest supply chains in the world. So I'm going to try and shed some light into the issues and why we need a change and why we need to redefine fashion somewhat. And then we can have a conversation, and I'd love to hear more from you all. But before I get going full swing, I just wanted to read the room a little. How versed are people on this topic? Is there anybody that is quite new to the subject? And if so, just either raise your hand or just say me in the chat. But if you're pretty well versed, you can click. So whoever's quite well versed with the subject, maybe you could click raise hand so I can read the room a little. There's a couple of you there. There's a few of you there that are quite well versed with the subject. And then we've got some. Okay, good. Super. So I'm going to bear with me as I try and share my screen. Right, I believe that my screen is visible now. Courtesy for today's session. Okay, those that have raised their hands can actually put them down now. Our digital emoji must be aching by now. So, courtesy of AI, I generated some images, and I thought it'd be fun to see what would come up when we put in future of fashion or redefining fashion. For a better future for people and planet. And these are the images that popped up. So for your amusement, this is what AI is telling us is the future of fashion. And yeah, I've never actually used the images like this before, but for today's sessions, I thought, why not? I then tried to generate that image to look a little bit like me, and I put black hair on her. It looked terrible, so I saved you that gaze and kept her as she is. But essentially, honestly, Tanya, you've still got your hand up. Did you have a question relevant before we kick off, or is that just from? No, okay. I saw you shake your head, so that's fine. So in order to redefine fashion, you have to open Pandora's box. You have to look at what's wrong. You have to acknowledge the complex system of fashion that we have. And you have to really face the dark side of fashion. Essentially, what we get to see commercially is the fun side of fashion, the glitz, the glamour, the runways, the lure of high street fashion, the lure of couture, and it can all seem quite lovely and attractive from the outset. But there are multiple hands, multiple chains of there are multiple steps before a garment ever reaches you to the high street or into your wardrobe. And what we really want the consumer to do is to think more about the process in terms of how clothing got to you, what your relationship is like to clothes. We have some major issues. We have a major detachment from makers these days. I know that as a child growing up in the 80s in England, I was making clothes with my mum and my aunties, partly because there weren't many shops that made Indian clothes. And I was at the time learning how to make and sew with my aunt and my mum and whatnot, which really gave me a whole new relationship with fashion, because I realized how long it actually took to cut, make, care for, and sew. And I honestly believe that if we really want to redefine fashion and our relationship with clothes, we need to start making a little bit. I personally think that in schools and as part of education, everyone should try and make one garment at least. That will stick with you for a lifetime. If you make something, you tend to appreciate the craft it takes to get it to be what it is. And there's a respect that comes with that. So I'm a huge advocate of get everyone to make one piece of clothing minimum. To understand process and to hopefully generate a respect for clothing, because we do have a massive issue of waste and a throwaway fashion culture. So look, we know that the current system is not working, and we are going to look into why. But essentially, at what point did it really go so wrong? And you can go far back to look at sort of key moments when things changed in the fashion industry, but we don't have all the time in the world. So I thought I'd just flash a little spotlight onto a key moment in the 1990s when Bill Clinton and his buddies and world leaders were signing free trade agreements. So NAFTA being one of them, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the WTO agreements, which were great for the idea of globalization. But essentially, what that did was outsource fashion to other parts of the world, essentially. And I'm going to just zone in on the fashion industry here. But a lot of accountability became outsourced too. So where brands started making in more developing countries to cut costs, to keep costs down, and to increase production and whatnot, there was a whole shift in responsibility. And it was quite an exciting time for organizations, for producers, but for makers and for local makers, it was quite a sad time, because what we saw was in the 2000s a rise in fast fashion, because there was overproduction and overconsumption was rife. Price points were coming down because it cost less to make products. There was more seasonality being pushed into the high street for sure. And there was a shift to cheap labor in development countries. And outsourcing to cut costs is quite troubling. And because what happens is there's this ultimate race to the bottom. Let's compete to offer cheaper products, and sort out to countries that have the lowest wages and the weakest labor laws. And that racing to the bottom means that factories cut corners, and they're cutting corners to meet demands of fast fashion brands. Essentially, that is a system that at some point just will not and cannot cope with the supply and demand situation. And at Fashion Revolution, we often talked about the money, fashion, power game. And who holds the power to change the system? And your money talks, just as producers mandate for I'm not going to go into money, fashion, power before we slide down that slope. We'll go into loss of domestic manufacturing jobs, which I mentioned, the deindustrialization. So, for example, in America, there were brands like Wrangler making locally. When a lot of these brands outsource a lot of craft, a lot of these craftspersons that are making locally no longer have jobs. What do? They go into other industries. So it's a bit sad. What we're seeing now is a lot more local making happening, but not enough. So that erosion of skills is something that we really need to acknowledge, and that we've seen happen these past 30 odd years because of these free trade agreements. There's loads of supply chain problems, simply because the chain is so big. Who is responsible to check? If you're a high street brand, for example, outsourcing your production to a developing country, and you have a manufacturer, however responsible that manufacturer might be, they then outsource. And I know in India, what we saw were a lot of brilliant factories, but there were a lot of home workers as well. And that was also not a bad thing, but there's some regulation issues that often get that are off the radar. So you don't always know who is working on your garment. So traceability becomes an issue, transparency becomes an issue. So there's that shift that we have to acknowledge and focus on, which is why at Fashion Revolution we are asking for more transparency, which is why organizations like the Orr Foundation are asking to know more about how much brands are producing. But look, labor exploitation and safety issues, a lot of people that buy clothing, and there's a lot of clothes bought in the world, they don't even know about labor exploitation and safety issues. These gleaming, glistening brands, a lot of us here today are quite versed with some of the issues, but typically the general consumer doesn't know about the complexities of the industry that they're buying from, or the brands that they're buying from. So while we think that there's more awareness raised, and while we know that there is a galvanization of spirit for conscious consumerism or sustainability and whatnot, there are a lot of issues just still not being addressed fast enough. There's a lot more work to do. Environmental degradation is a massive one. Weak environmental regulations in some of the countries, many of the countries that are commissioned to produce a lot of our fashion these days are having there's a lot of water issues that we're seeing in countries like Bangladesh, in India, and so forth. And some of it comes from the fact that the regulation is simply not there. I'm not saying that's everybody. There's some manufacturing plants that I've seen and witnessed myself that are just doing a brilliant job. But there's generally en masse globally, there's an irresponsible disposal of chemicals and waste into local water supplies. And that's a big, big issue. Fashion is one of the most polluting industries in the world, and often people are shocked to hear that, but it really is. And there is an ever-increasing buying culture, so it's not about to stop anytime soon. We need more innovation, we need more regulation, we need greater governance, and it's only going to happen if we keep asking for it. So diving into the waste issue, essentially people are buying more, they're consuming more, they're wearing items of clothing much less than they ever used to. So because fashion is so cheap now, they are, instead of buying, say, one t-shirt, for example, people can buy several t-shirts in several colors. And it's getting worn a lot less than it used to. And there is this overall mass idea that you can just pack up your clothes and dump them into TextAid or send them to a charity shop and they'll then get sold or get a second home. The fact is, not all of these clothes get recycled, not all of these clothes get a second home. It's a bit like from the free trade where it becomes somebody else's problem, right? So you've bought, you've consumed, and then you dump. But then what? Then what happens? That's somebody else's problem now. Well, the fact is, most of our clothes are loaded with synthetic, are made synthetically and loaded with petrochemicals and carbon and plastic, and we'll go into that later. But while I've said here that there's about 100 billion garments produced each year, 92 million of those end up in landfills. And these are combined statistics from Ellen MacArthur, McKinsey, Earth.org, and WEF. The number might be significantly more. So it is questioned whether that's actually correct, because it could be a lot more, because there's a whole there's a robust campaign at the moment called Speak Volumes, and we really want to know how much brands are producing. Has anyone come across that campaign yet? And if you have, raise your hand. All foundations driving it. Okay, I can see that there's one hand that I saw go up there. But essentially, there is a call for people to talk, for brands to share how much they're producing, because these are figures based on estimations and sort of that kind of assessment. And why is it important to know about how much we're producing? Again, we're going to jump into that into a sec, but essentially the rush for competitive prices, weekly seasons, means that we really need to just slow it down a little bit. And that's what our call is as campaigners. We're saying just slow it all down a little bit. Do we need a new season every week? That's almost 52 seasons a year that some brands are churning around. And also, how are a lot of these brands figuring out what the consumer's going to buy? You know, there's a lot of opaque methods and process out there, and I think brands just need to be a little bit more open, a bit more transparent, and talk to each other, and really look into the Speak Volumes campaign to learn more about that overproduction issue. But many of you would have read this slide, so I'm not going to reread all of that, which is the point of having it on there. But just to let it land. So on average, people are buying 60% more clothes today than they did 15 years ago. But they're keeping each item half as long. So if 85% of those textiles end up in landfills, somebody did some maths, that's the equivalent to one garbage truck full of clothes being dumped every second. So I've been speaking, I think, for about 8 minutes, 80, yeah, something like that. So I've been speaking, so imagine how many seconds and how many clothes have been dumped just in the moment that we've been talking to each other. That's a lot of clothes, and there's a massive problem there. So Fashion Revolution said, look, we need to start being the squeaky hinge that asks all those questions and hopefully gets the oil one day. Not literally, but we say ask questions, be curious, find out more, do something. So in 2013, when the Rana Plaza disaster happened, a group of environmentalists, fashion, sustainability experts got together and said, look, something needs to be done. This shouldn't be happening on our watch. And then the global network came together, and many of us were part of launching this campaign, Who Made My Clothes? And the point of it is to get the consumer taking action. And we have social media and digital engagement at our fingertips, which means that we can, at the click of a button, make some noise and speak directly to brands and give these organizations a heads up that we are watching, we are asking, and we want to know who made my clothes. Are they paid fairly? Are they being exploited? Are they being looked after? When I buy into your brand, what am I buying into? Am I buying into fair practice? Do you consider environmental degradation in your process, or do you not? So thousands of people took part, and over 10 years we've had millions of engagement, and we've had brands reply and makers reply, and really I think the beauty of this campaign was just to enable people to do something. Social media might not be what changes the world, but it certainly can be a way of saying that we care, and to let brands know that we're watching them. So here's some of our impact, which I think is quite impressive. This is just April alone. So every April, in honor of Rana Plaza, we have a Fashion Revolution week, and throughout the month around the world, there's lots of activities that happen. And the point is to keep galvanizing, and keep uniting and keep collaborating to spotlight all the issues that the fashion industry is sometimes trying to hide. So we're just sort of letting them know that it's not going to be something we just forget about. So keep raising awareness. And lots of events happen around the world in many different ways and shapes and forms. And everyone is welcome to be part of the movement. So look, what's in my clothes is another question that we encourage people to ask. So the evolution of who made my clothes, then the response came in, I made your clothes. And then the evolution was actually what's in my clothes. Because quite frankly, our clothes are now loaded with, sorry, one second, I'm just trying to move my screen. There you go. Our clothes are loaded with petrochemicals, and are made predominantly synthetically. And we really need to address the fact that your skin is breathing fossil fuels. Your skin is bleeding. Your clothes are bleeding microplastics into the ocean every time you wash them. Now, who actually thinks about how many microplastics are running into the ocean from a wash? And I mean, I'm going to ask you all a question now. Who is a little bit guilty of maybe overwashing their clothes? You know, I mean, I'm going to raise my hand now. I'm trying to be more mindful, but I have a 4-year-old daughter, and I am not one of those mums that has to put all the clothes into the wash after one wear, but I know many parents that do that. So I'll be the one that keeps things for a few wears and then puts them in the wash. And it's my way of trying to encourage a bit of change. my way of being mindful of the fact that, you know, by washing, I'm also not helping the situation. Although a lot of clothes that are in, say, my daughter's wardrobe, and mine are a combination, they might not be loaded with microplastics. But the fact is, to be living a more sort of slower and more simpler life, and to encourage a more sustainable kind of way of life, by washing less doesn't mean you're going to stink more. It just means that you're just going to show a little bit of a it's an action of care. So just be mindful of all these little things. And I think a lot of people are shocked. Like, the average person's quite shocked when you tell them that your clothes are shedding microplastics into water systems. Polyester alone accounts for over half of the fiber used in the fashion industry. And a lot of people say, but what is polyester? You know, how do we not, sorry, 1 second, I've got pop-ups coming. You can read my emails. So look, if the fashion industry continues to rely on fossil fuel-based textiles by 2050, it could use up more than a quarter of the world's remaining carbon budget necessary to limit global warming to 2 degrees. I would recommend that you all read A New Textiles Economy, Redesigning Fashion's Future by Ellen MacArthur Foundation. It's really worth a good read. And sort of, as we're redefining fashion, let's look at redesigning fashion's future. How can you refine or redefine your wardrobe, and which fabrics should I buy or avoid? Is there a materials expert in the room? If there is, please do raise your hand. So I saw a few little shakes. So there's maybe some people that know a little bit about materials, well versed. Now I'm not an expert on materials, but I have great friends that are experts in materials, and I lean on them to ask questions, because that's a whole other arm of learning. But what I generally do is read up about fabrics, and it's hard to do when you're buying or shopping and you want to have information fast. I wish you could just scan a label and know more about the product that you're wearing or you're about to buy into. But what I do is, look, I have a wardrobe that is a mixture of natural fabrics, and I also have synthetic fabrics. But what I am doing is I'm reducing certain fabrics because I've read up about them, and I've just know that those choices are right for me. So redefining my wardrobe and redefining my fashion, I've said, like, I'm going to reduce polyester, rayon, acrylic, and conventional cotton. Fun fact, conventional cotton is so cotton is very water thirsty as a crop, and it's often farmed and it's loaded with pesticides, and essentially that's not good for our soil, and you'll be wearing that on your body. So really look, and if you can opt for a GOTS or a fair trade or an organic cotton, go for that as opposed to conventional. It's not going to be a deep dive today. Maybe in question time we can go into materials a bit more, but I think it's really important to incorporate organic hemp, organic linen, organic or recycled cotton. I've put silk in there, but there's a big question mark about silk as well. It gets quite complicated, but you know, I have 2 wardrobes. I have an Indian wardrobe and I have a Western wardrobe. So I really have to do the homework a few times over. One other thing to bear in mind is that there are all sorts of theories about our clothing that we're wearing, the more plastic that's in our clothes. We really need to think about how that impacts our health. And there's a lot of research happening, but there's not enough that has been done. But there are lines of thought that a lot of the clothes we're wearing can actually influence and affect hormone regulation and whatnot. So dig into that a bit deeper if you want to know more. It's a big subject and there's not enough time to go into that today, but what you are wearing affects your body because essentially your skin is a breathing organ. So yeah, I wanted to actually share something about acrylic, and this is a couple of them that I'm going to shed a light on, and then we should go into questions soon as well. But acrylic production involves highly toxic chemicals that can be dangerous to the health of factory workers that are working with them. And imagine a lot of the clothes that people work out in are fused with like acrylic and whatnot. But there's a key ingredient called acrylonitrile, and it can actually enter the wearer's body through skin contact or inhalation. So imagine that wearing a certain fabric could actually be harmful to your health. That's why it's important to ask questions like, what's in my clothes? So read, if anyone wants to do a bit of Sunday homework or Tuesday night homework, go and read some of your labels and have a little search about what it took to make that fabric. Let's not forget that chemical companies like DuPont were involved in producing and encouraging a lot of our synthetic clothing. So a lot of the clothing that is in the world is actually being originally engineered or organized and encouraged because of chemical companies, and the oil company, fossil fuels, have got their hand in the fashion pocket through and through. So think about that, and think about why we are all wearing fossil fuel fashion mostly these days. So there's a lot of fabrics that I've listed there, and that's not even half of the ones that are available to you all. And I've put wool, modal, leather and bamboo as it's complicated there simply because of process, and we can go into that into the chat later if you want to. I thought it might be useful just to share, and this is quite personal. It really is personal to me. I thought some of the brands and shops that I buy from, and I'm not saying they're the best brands in the world, far from it. But just to, if I fancy a little bit of luxury, or I want to look into some new innovation fabric, I look at Stella McCartney. And if I'm feeling indulgent, I might invest in a piece from there. I'm really interested in knowing their process, and actually I'm not sure how sustainable or transparent they are, but seeing as I live in Switzerland now, I am looking at this local brand and maker avidly. Anita Dongre for my grassroots India wear. I love her work with artisans and craft in India. And there's a lot of online shops there which I've shared simply because they source a lot of local ethical makers, and they share information about where they're made and who they're made from. Some of the brands on there and some of the materials used, I question, and sometimes I choose not to buy an outfit. I love it so much, but I choose not to buy it because I just don't believe in that fabric. It means that I take a lot more time to shop, and I'm not an impulse buyer. I do miss the days, maybe 20 years ago, when I used to impulse buy. Ignorance is bliss. And there was this impulse buying phase, which didn't mean that I bought lots, but it just meant that I went for something that was aesthetic, as opposed to now where I might like the aesthetics of something, but I stop and I don't go for it. So buying takes a whole new approach when you want to be a more mindful consumer. These organizations that I've listed on the right, these are just some organizations that I think are worth looking into for more information about materials. I do a lot of brainstorming with the Right Project. There's two women that run it, originally from England. One's in France, one's in England now. And they really decode the complex world of fashion. They also offer one-on-ones with people. So if you want to learn more from the Right Project, they're very, very approachable. And what I love is they don't just advise corporations, they also can help advise individuals. very quickly, Stella McCartney just launched It's About Effing Time, a campaign that is spotlighting animal cruelty in the fashion industry. And this is something that Stella does really well. And you know, some of her materials are questionable in terms of impact on the planet, but at the same time, the love for innovation and wanting to sort of shift the system that Stella McCartney does is excellent. And this launched this week, so I just wanted to shed some light on the lovely Eva Mendes, who's also supporting the campaign, as is Ray, shedding light about animal fur and just how beautiful clothing can be without killing an animal. So just think about, what are your clothes made from and what do they represent about you? I turned to Kerry Wilde. She's a brilliant secret that I'm sharing and just throwing into the mix here, and I think spread word, because what she did, and she's a soul stylist, and what I love about her is she doesn't come on, she's not one of those oh fashion, darling, we've got to make you look great. She sort of taps into the soul and spirit of who you are, and she works with men and women. And I was getting really overwhelmed with making choices, and I'm not a great buyer, so I just stopped buying, and I felt quite drabby after a while. And let's face it, it is nice to adorn yourself from time to time, but I want to adorn myself in a more thoughtful and more considerate and mindful way. So Kerry really helped me and worked with me, and we did this whole process of cleansing the closet and getting new stuff in a really good way, and she is excellent. So I just wanted to share that if it's too much for you to think about how to redefine your wardrobe, turn to experts, and this is just one of them. Really fast summation, and I asked the right project to tell me, how do we actually summarize the shift for creative accountability? So the old systems: take, make, discard, and then the new system could be borrow. Clothes swaps are rising. Ask friends. In my culture, in the Indian culture, there's a lot of borrowing that goes on because we have a lot of festivities, we have a lot of weddings, we love to celebrate, and our outfits are, you know, quite quite an investment. But luckily, we also have this culture of sharing. So it's not unusual for me to sort of borrow from a sister or a cousin or a friend. We do that a lot. And I'm seeing that happening more in the Western world with renting runways and whatnot, and transform and return. And to go slightly deeper, this explains how the take, make, discard, say hyper seasons, extractive economy, opaque supply chains, globalized industry, disconnection, leads to the fabricated demand and excavated waste. So on the flip of that, what we're calling for is a slow fashion in a more circular economy. Let's not be fooled though. Circular economy is not necessarily the long-term answer. It's partially an answer to what is a very complex system in fashion. But what we do want is more transparent value chains. And there is a transparency index that Fashion Revolution produces biannually now, I think. So it's worth looking at that to see where your favorite brands rank. We sort of rank the top 250, or I say they. I'm now former Fashrev. But we really want to encourage a reconnection to process. And what I'm loving is the new rising made-to-order design for reuse and the extended producer responsibility. So really hunt out those brands that are just like ready to share what they do and how they do it. And to end on this note, which I think Joss Whipple says really well, it's important to focus on the areas that are most relevant to you, your brand, and your job role. Keep returning to social, environmental sustainability within the context of your day-to-day purpose and operations. Your work is absolutely needed, and you're not alone. Sometimes it feels like you're fighting the tide. whether it's the food or fashion industry or whatever it might be. But let's not look at it as fighting the tide, and let's just start creating new. And that, I think, is a really healthy way of embarking on your personal journey in redefining fashion. Create new ways of reinventing your wardrobe. Be okay with what you have. Don't have to feel the pressure of keeping up with the Joneses, but more to the point, find your fabrics. Know what you like. Start figuring out touch and feel of fabrics. Start touching, feeling. It's a bit like, you know, back in the day, my nan used to take me to buy food and groceries, and she used to always smell the mangoes or smell the apples or smell the fruit to know if it's good or not. What's to stop us touching and feeling our clothes and knowing if we want to wear them? Let's not just look at it and think that's a good shape, but do we like the feeling of it? And if you learn a little bit, it doesn't take long to learn about the fabrics, just on a surface level. It's worth knowing how you're going to then sculpt your new wardrobe or reshape your current one. And I think we should now take questions.